Good evening. I'm Sarah Churchwell, Chair of Public Understanding of the Humanities at the University of London School of Advanced Study and Director of the Being Human Festival. A couple of notes before we begin this evening's event. Please note that the chat function is closed for this event, but we will be having a Q&A later with our speakers. For this, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. There should be a little icon for this in your toolbar. Please be aware that this event is being recorded, including the Q&A session. Please note that any question you ask and the answer you give will form part, or sorry, the answer they give, you're not going to give the answer, will form part of the recording that will subsequently be made available online. You can ask your question anonymously by ticking the anonymized box before you submit your question. This evening's event is part of the Being Human Festival of the Humanities, which continues throughout this week until the 22nd of November. Being Human is the UK's National Festival of the Humanities, run by the School of Advanced Study, University of London, in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. Events are mostly online this year, and you can see the full program on the Being Human Festival website. If you want to tweet about tonight's event or the festival in general, you can find us at Being Human Fest, and please use the hashtag BeingHuman2020. We would also be very grateful if you could complete our evaluation survey at the end of this event, a link for which should be popping into your chat box now and will also be circulated via email afterwards. This is really helpful for ensuring that events like this remain free and that we can continue to improve them. So your feedback really is incredibly valuable. If you can take a minute or two to give that, we'd be really grateful. Tonight, I'm delighted to welcome Kit de Waal and Corinna van Dalen-Oskam, who I'll be discussing literature, but really my favorite topic, with, and in particular, we're going to be talking about the benefits of a more diverse, inclusive diet of reading. I like this metaphor. And we'll be thinking about the voices and values that form the literary canon. From Black Lives Matter to the Me Too movement and Extinction Rebellion, we're living in a time when many vocal campaigners demand changes to the way in which society is run and the voices that we hear in our official conversations and discourses. These debates affect the books we read, the ones we teach in our schools, and that get turned into popular dramas as we consume through entertainment and through education. So this evening, we're going to discuss the canon of English literature, the books that are generally, if not unanimously, agreed to be good, important, worth studying. And we're going to be exploring the movements towards revision that are currently happening and the changes that may still need to be made. Well, I'm going to be more categorical, that do still need to be made. Before I talk to Kit about these important topics, I'm going to welcome Professor Corinna van Dalen-Oskam from the, I practiced this earlier and I'm still going to get it wrong, the Huygens Institute for the History of the Netherlands. Corinna is going to share with you her project Novel Perceptions and ask you to take part in a short quiz where you can anonymously share your opinions about the literary quality of some contemporary fiction. So I'm going to hand things over to Corinna for a few moments so that we can all play a quiz.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm glad to be here. Let me take a moment to start my PowerPoint presentation. Here we are. My name is Corinna van Dalen-Oskam, and I'm a professor in computational literary studies in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And I'd like to talk to you a bit about a new research project I'm working on in the team of Professor Bas Groes at the University of Wolverhampton. The project is named Novel Perceptions. And what we want to do is find out why readers perceive some novels as highly literary and others as not literary at all. For this, we need the opinions of lots of readers and non-readers So earlier today, we launched a large survey in which we asked people to rate novels they have read or haven't read for their literary quality. And I'll show you the link later. We've also been collaborating with BBC Arts on the project Novels That Shaped Our World. This is the wrong slide. A celebration of 300 years of English novels. And a panel of Kit de Waal and others selected 100 novels that shaped their world. And these novels are receiving a lot of extra attention in all kinds of events, such as this one that you are now joining. What I'm going to do is to present to you a short alternative poll that also covers some of the novels on the list of 100 novels that shaped our world. And I'll show you the covers of 5 novels. And for each of the covers, I will ask, how literary do you think this novel is? And you will then see the following 8 options. And I'd like you to select the one that best reflects your own personal opinion. So, are you ready? This is just a little bit about the 100 novels that shaped our world and some of the surveys we linked to that, but have a look at this cover. Now, you probably didn't expect that I would leave out the name of the author and the title of the novel, but have a go anyhow. It will become clear later why I did that. So, how literary do you think this novel is? Just check one of the options. And when I see that most of you have voted, I will share the results with you. You have a couple of more seconds. Well, let's see what the results are. I'll share the results with you. And you see that most of you think this novel is highly literary. So let's see what the novel was. It was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And perhaps you recognize the cover. And the full title of Shelley's novel is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. And this is a reference to classical mythology. Publisher Penguin likes to use details of classic paintings to emphasize the status of the canonical literature as a great work of art. And I guess you kind of agreed with this book being highly literary. By the way, the cover shows a detail from an 18th century painting by Nicolai Abildgaard, which is shown in the National Gallery of Denmark. So let's go to the next one. The second cover. So I'll relaunch the poll so that you can again give your opinion. How literary do you think this novel is? A couple of more minutes. Yes, seconds, I mean. Okay, let's have a look at the results. I'll share the results on screen. And literary, most of you think this novel is very literary. Let's go and have a look at the name of the author and the title. Cormac McCarthy, The Road. This is a very intriguing cover that brilliantly captures the novel's story about an adult and child walking alone through a post-apocalyptic world. And the cover doesn't necessarily convey that this is highbrow literary. So it's interesting to see that many of you scored the book so highly. This novel has very swiftly become a modern classic, perhaps aided by the film adaptation with Viggo Mortensen in it. So let's stop sharing the results and try another one. I'll give you the opportunity to give your opinion about the literary quality of this novel. Ah, this is getting really interesting. Let's see what the results are. I'm sharing the results now, and we're tending towards the non-literary in this group. So let's see. The author Helen Fielding and the title Bridget Jones' Diary. So this is a very in-your-face cover with its pink color and wine glass. It's probably meant to appeal to women. And the humorous glitzy cover is unpretentious and does not announce that this is highbrow literature, but either the opposite. And the introduction by Caitlin Moran, the writer of How to Build a Girl and How to Be a Woman, also speak to the target audience. 2 more to go. Stop share the results. What about this one? I'll relaunch the poll again. So what's your opinion about the literariness of this one? Many of you have already voted. So let's have a look. So somewhat literary and literary. Well, let's have a look what the real author and title were. The Reluctant Fundamentalist. And this cover is very painterly. It made me think of some of the paintings by Francis Bacon. And interestingly, The Reluctant Fundamentalist takes its cue from Albert Camus' existentialist novel The Fall, La Chute, published in 1956. And of course, the publisher could also have opted for a spectacular, threatening image on the cover to evoke association with terrorism in the post 9/11 climate. But the image you now see foregrounds the novel's meditation on existentialist questions and the quest for identity in a fractured 21st century world. So the final one for today, cover number 5. What are your thoughts about this one? In a couple of seconds, I'll show the results again. So let's have a look. This seemed to be literary. So let's uncover the cover again. James Baldwin, Giovanni's Room. And this weekend we put this image on Twitter and we got some interesting responses. People associated it with the 1970s. And one person thought this was a detective novel by Raymond Chandler, scoring it a bit literary. Someone else said that illustration looks like it has been created in the 70s by an amateur illustrator, rating it as tending towards the non-literary. The people who recognized this as being a novel by James Baldwin scored it very highly literary. And well, you kind of agree in that direction. Baldwin's book covers often have black and white photographs on them so that the association with a classic canonical status is enhanced. So why did I show the covers without the author name and the title? Well, I think it became clear that you did have an idea about the literary quality of the novel. And publishers carefully select a cover, making sure that potential readers will evaluate the book in a certain way. And so the covers influence the reader to be in a certain direction. Of course, there's much more to novels than their covers, and that's why we have set up the 2020 Reader Review, which can be seen as the largest ever survey of novels in the English language. The survey was launched earlier today, and it presents a list of 400 novels published in English for the first time in 2014 or later. And it not only asks the readers for their personal opinions about literary quality, but also asks non-readers about their opinions about novels they did not read. So it is indeed a survey for all who are interested in fiction. And I do hope you will share your opinions and that you will enjoy the survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karina, for that look at how book covers impact our ideas of literary quality. I think something that is fascinating for all readers, because as you say, we all encounter books for the first time through their covers. And many of us who are book lovers have multiple editions of books with different covers and have different relationships to those covers. So it's always revealing to think through it in those kind of defamiliarizing ways. Please do pop any questions you have for Karina in the Q&A box. We'll pick those up towards the end of the event, getting ahead of myself. But I would now like to introduce Kit de Waal, author of The Trick to Time and My Name is Leon, for which she won the Kerry Group Irish Novel of the Year in 2017. She's also recently been involved with the BBC Arts Novels That Shaped Our World project, which asked a panel of leading writers, curators, and critics to choose 100 genre-busting novels that have had an impact on their lives. So welcome, Kit. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much. That was such a fascinating quiz. I absolutely loved it. I'll definitely be doing it because I couldn't get enough of that sort of thing. It's great.
Right, me too. I absolutely love that, and I think for those of us who teach literature as well, it's a really useful way of kind of getting students to question their own assumptions, even getting them to think about the covers before they even enter the book. So it's something I've been playing around with for years myself, and I found that really, really fascinating. So you've been involved in the design of your own book covers. Can you say something about your involvement in that process?
Yes, so when My Name is Leon was published, obviously I was a brand new author. I didn't know anything about the literary world at all. And they just sent me the cover and I loved it. But I honestly didn't know that I could not love it because I just thought they did it. You know, they put a wrapper on it, as I called it, and sent it out into the world. So I just went, oh, it's great, it's lovely. And my agent rang me up and she said, do you really like it? I said, yeah, I really like it. She said, you know you can object. And I was amazed that I could object. I mean, I wouldn't, I loved it. When the paperback came out, that was different. So that when the paper, for a start, I didn't know you had a different cover for the paperback. I was amazed. I kept thinking, why can't we keep it? Because I loved it. And the paperback cover we did go around the houses. I hated the first thing they came up with. And I liked the paperback cover. I didn't love it the same amount, but they took soundings from the first cover and people going, oh, I thought it looked a bit depressing. I was like, it is. So, you know, why not have that? So they changed and tweaked it. So it can be difficult. You know, I mean, I've only had mostly good, you know, experiences, but it can be difficult if you don't like what is actually going to go out in the world and sit in Waterstones and be you. You know, you're associated with that couple.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually, isn't it? Because in some cases, with really with commercial fiction, as you know, authors have less leeway than that. So there are cases where, of course, covers have been forced on authors over their objections, even though they hated them. Do you actually build it into your contract now, or is that just your working assumption with your editors?
No, I don't even give my books a title. I am so bad. So I write the book and I call them a number. So Leon was number 3 and I'm now working on number 10. I don't care. You call it whatever, because it's my job to write the book. And when I give it over to my editor, that's it. Don't tell me about what it's doing on Amazon. I don't care. Don't tell me. I've done the thing. You do the rest.
Oh, I absolutely love that. I'm going to use that. I'm completely going to take numbers from now on. I do actually say to I'm the same thing. I really struggle with titles, and I say to my editors, you need to come up with the title. And, you know, and that is partly a marketing consideration, of course, too, is what do they think will put across the thing that you've done.
Yes.
We've been talking for the last few minutes and through Karina's quiz about the idea of literariness, this question of like how literary those books were, judging on the images. But of course, that assumes that we actually have a working definition of literary and what it means to be highly literary or less literary. And I was wondering if that's something that, A, you have a kind of working definition of yourself, and is it something you think about while you're writing? Is literariness part of the frame?
Yeah, again, you know, I am really still very new to the literary world. So I got published, Leon came out when I was 56. That was like 4 years ago. And before that, I didn't know the term literary fiction. I left school at 16 and I didn't know what postmodern meant. And all these phrases, I just thought, that's a good book. That's a good book from school. That's not a good book from school. That's a bestseller. I would have recognized those phrases. I didn't understand phrases like, I mean, I understood what the classics were, but I wouldn't have known what qualified a book to be a classic. So when I was told my book was literary fiction, and I didn't know that was better or worse than anything else. I was just like, okay. Since then, I think the term literary fiction can be a stick to beat people with. I mean, there is such an amazing amount of snobbery around what people read and what people admit to have read. You know, oh yes, Jane Eyre. Well, you know, there's loads of people that haven't read Jane Eyre. They might know the story, or Dickens or whatever, but we feel that there are certain books we should have read. When the Booker Prize comes out, you get, and the Women's Prize, you get this sort of surge of titles that people think they need to like and buy into. So for me, the working title I use for something that's literary fiction, and not exclusively, is what Italo Calvino said, which was a classic is a book that hasn't finished saying what it's got to say. So in other words, it can be reimagined over and over for a new audience, for a new time. And there are lots of books that fit that category. But I think the reason we are still reading Jane Eyre is because it has something different to say. And one of the annoying things, which is that everlasting remakes of Pride and Prejudice, which drive me up the bloody wall. But the reason they make it is because there is a new audience. There are people that have gone from 10 to 20 in the last remaking of Pride and Prejudice, and it has something else to say. So although that sort of thing irritates me, I do get it, why certain books are everlastingly referred to and seen as a classic, and modern classics fall into that category as well.
Yeah, but it
Sorry,
also
that's such a long answer. Sorry.
No, it was a great answer. It was exactly what I was curious about, but also I think that your answer, that Pride and Prejudice is a perfect example, suggests the ways in which this is a false binary anyway, because Pride and Prejudice is immensely popular in the ways that you're just saying. People love it, whether they've read the novel or not. They love the story, and people do love reading the novel, even if they don't think of themselves as literary readers. So we get ourselves, bound up in these categories that aren't necessarily how people approach books or how they read. And clearly that was the kind of impetus, or at least part of the impetus behind the BBC Novels That Shaped Our World project, which set out to celebrate 300 years of the English language novel without sticking to those rigid received categories about what a classic was or what a great novel was. So first of all, can you just tell us, give us a couple of examples of novels that shaped your world view, your life personally?
Novels that are on the list?
It doesn't matter.
Okay,
just
so
what do you think of?
I had to sacrifice a novel.
Oh, perfect. Bring that one in. Yeah.
I couldn't get it through the, everybody's, we all sacrifice something. I sacrificed Arnold Bennett because not enough people had read him. I would have had any Arnold Bennett book, particularly The Old Wives' Tale. It's beautiful. It's so well written. It's a novel from, Arnold Bennett was from Stoke-on-Trent. He was a great philanthropist. He gave, I think it was £500 for a young writer, like a scholarship type thing. He was a great friend of Flaubert and Zola, and he wrote women so well. And he wrote almost exclusively about the domestic, the interior, the life that happened inside of the house, not the adventures outside of the house, which fine, they're great. But as we all know, the relationships and the power struggles and the stuff that goes on within four walls are at least as exciting and interesting as, climbing a mountain. And sometimes it does feel like climbing a mountain, what's going on inside. And he was the master of this. And so I really wanted that to go on the list. But it was, I think it was going into love and relationships. And there was just so many, obviously, in that category that I couldn't get it through.
Well, I'm glad you put him in here. I'm a big fan of Bennett as well. I would add the Grand Babylon Hotel. The thing is, and it's a good example of what we're talking about there, like as with Austen as well, because people hear Arnold Bennett, if they've heard of him at all, and they think, oh, old Victorian, probably stuffy, probably old-fashioned. And in fact, as you say, he's hilarious. He's really modern. I think it's a wonderful example. And as you say, classics as novels that have more to tell us, that have stories to keep telling us. That project, the Novels That Shape Our World project, produced a list of 100 novels, as you say, that was obviously hard fought over, to act as an alternative canon, to expand the canon, to think about it differently. And part of the list included fiction that is very popular now. That has shaped the popular imagination very recently, such as Game of Thrones and The Hunger Games. How do you think that those kinds of books, I don't want to ask you kind of characterize how they're different, but what do you think is the importance of including books like that in a list of canonical works? And what do they say about our times now?
For me, it's really important not to be too exclusive and not to ignore the fact that people love something. And if people love something, that's almost all it has to be on there. I would draw the line at 50 Shades of Grey. But, just because something's popular does not devalue it. If anything, it puts more of a value on it because you have more people that love it, especially something like Harry Potter, like Game of Thrones, which I haven't read at all, but I do know that it may have turned people onto reading. I've watched Game of Thrones, it's fantastic, let me go and read the books. That's an amazing thing to do. Same thing with Harry Potter. Children that don't read, read. And so it has changed their world, it's changed their relationship with words and with reading. And some of the characters, like Harry Potter himself, who was a bit of a geeky boy that wore glasses, that's made a hero out of all the children who have worn glasses and felt embarrassed about it. So there's so many things about popular literature that give them the right to be in a list of the canon, at least as much as books like Dickens, that were written, you know, every week. They were written for the masses. They weren't exclusive books. They were written in a cheap format that you bought them every week, and it was, you know, like going to buy Prima magazine or whatever. You know, of course, it was the reading public. It wasn't everybody. But he would not have said, it's popular, therefore it's rubbish, or it's popular, therefore I don't want it. Every author wants to be read, and every author wants more readers. So I think it's really important not to exclude those books. And at the end of the day, a lot of the categories and the genres that we read now, they are the publishing industry's genre. And you know, domestic fiction, domestic noir, this psychological thriller, psychological suspense, those categories, they're for marketing. That doesn't change the content of the book. And I think we should try and do away with the literary fiction label and lots of the other. And is it a good book? Is it a popular book? Do people want to read it? I understand in marketing terms why they do that. But I do think it's a bit, I think it's hard for people when they've written a book and it's like chick lit, which is a phrase I loathe and take exception to. And then it's denigrated. Oh, your book's available in Tesco's. I'd like my books to be available in Tesco's. I'd like more people to read them. But it becomes a Tesco novel where, you know, and I think that's only a negative thing. It makes people ashamed of what they read, and that's only ever a bad thing.
Yeah. I absolutely agree, but it's also when you think about the logic of it, when you get the highly literary writers or the highly challenging, difficult modernist writers, and they'll sometimes say things like you say that to suggest that if it's popular, it's bad.
Yes.
And then you go, well, by that logic, the best novels are the ones that nobody likes. Is that what you're saying? But it doesn't make sense to say that a best novel is a novel that no one likes. How can that be a best novel? It doesn't even make, what's your definition of best in that in that statement? You know, it doesn't even make any sense.
And obviously what they're saying is it needs to be read by the right people.
Exactly.
They don't want the woman that shops at Tesco to be picking it up and putting it next to the cornflakes. They want it agonized over in hat charts. And that's the snobbery of it, because the only way, the woman that reads her type of novel with the gold leaf cover, you know, and the pink fluffy front, she's being entertained, and that's a valid way. That's a valid reason to write a book, to entertain people. It doesn't have to change your world in that way. It has to entertain you over and over. Yeah.
Now, I'm a big believer in defense of escapism, our right to just read because we want to escape.
Because I like the book.
Yeah, that's a really important thing to be able to do. So by this logic, then, if you were in charge of the world, would you just get rid of the whole idea of a canon? Would you just say we don't need it? Or does it serve a useful purpose?
I think it serves a really useful purpose. And when I was asked to be on the, I mean, I love the classics. I absolutely love the classics. It was my diet. It was my training for being a writer. I read hundreds of the classics just because I was on a reading roll, and I didn't read anything from the time I left school. And I think there's a really important place for lists, because they turn you on to things you may have missed, especially a list like the novels that shape the world, because they were categorized. Now, I'm never going to pick anything from the fantasy section, ever. Fantasy and other worlds, I'm not interested. It's just not my taste. I may not read, you know, I might read the crime and thriller, I might skip that section. But I think if you're just looking for something to read, and you want to have a discussion with other people about books, then I think a canon's useful. Alternative canons are useful. I think the exclusivity of the canon can be a problem. You know, who says that that book's got to be on there? And I think the more democratic and the more lists that you have, perhaps there should be 5 lists or a list a year. That's what I'd like to see. I just don't like this where something is decided on in 1910 and that's it. You can't join, lads. We've got 100 books here. That's it. So I would like to see it just to be more fluid. But I do think lists have a place in, you know, in the literary world, just to help turn us on to books we may have not known about.
Yeah. And of course, that's one of the logics of reading for those of us who love to read expansively, is that not just to read books that replicate what we already knew that we liked, or that speak to our own experiences, but actually that broaden our horizons. I mean, that can be one of the great pleasures of literature. Do you think that this year, as it's been a year that has brought so much focus around questions of social justice, emancipation, discrimination, and there's of course been an upsurge of reading during lockdown and the pandemic. Do you think that those changes in our life today are going to expand the canon more quickly? Do you think that it will start to accelerate this move toward a more inclusive canon?
I don't know. I think if more people are reading, that's always a good thing. I think whether or not that expands the canon or not, I think I would personally like to try and break free of the stranglehold of what I read. And I have done that slightly in lockdown, just because I haven't been able to read longer books. I've read a lot of biographies for some reason, and I think that's great. As for expanding the canon, I think we have, I mean, always towards the end of the year, you have this, Guardian list, the Times list, people saying, these are the books to read, these are the books to read. I only ever scan them to see if anyone's recommended my book, by the way. That's it. That's the only reason I look at those lists. But what I do sometimes is think, oh, I should read that. And again, the should can be a bit of a bad thing, like the Booker Prize, there's going to be a Booker Prize, and will we have read it? And we all sort of feel we should have read the prize winners, and, we should at least know about them or skim them. We've probably all got something by the bed that we should read. And I think the best thing that could come out of the lockdown is that we read what we want to read, rather than reading what we should read, that's going to make us look intelligent or literary or worthy or up to date. And just, if we want to read, I don't know, Animal Farm again for the 5th time, just read that. Read what brings you comfort.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, particularly in times of stress and crisis like this. Like there's, not necessarily the time to be pushing yourself because life is stressful enough.
Totally.
Find pleasure where you can, instead of turning something that could be pleasurable into something that becomes a duty or yet another piece of work, instead of just something that you can relax into. You used part of your advance for My Name is Leon to create a creative writing fellowship at Birkbeck University of London, that you want to stimulate the presence of the working classes in the arts in particular. We've been talking about inclusivity in a general sense and about the snobbery of literariness, but within the canon of English literature as we currently know it, even thinking about it in inclusive terms, do you think it still has a recognizable bias about class in terms of the authors that are included, the voices that are included, and are these types of bias that you've encountered in your personal experience with the book world?
Yeah, so when I started reading when I was 23, and I didn't read at all before then, and when I started reading when I was 23, it's because I had said to my boss, give me 10 books, give me the 10 best books, because I've got to basically stop getting pissed and taking drugs. I wanted an alternative. So he gave me 10 books, and the 10 books he gave me were the classics. He gave me 10 classic books, and he was a military man. So I had The Siege of Krishnapur, The Red Badge of Courage, The Riddle of the Sands, and I didn't know any of them. So I literally just bought the 10 books and I read them, and I was like, yeah, quite good, And then I noticed that they all had black spines, because they were Penguin classics. So I just thought, oh, that's where the good books are. So I went back to Dillon's as it was then. I just bought another 5 and another 5 and another 5. And I probably stopped when I'd read about 100, maybe 150. I just ate them alive and I loved them before I started being more discriminating, and then finding that I actually liked about 1910 or 1920. And I like domestic, and I like small worlds, and blah, blah, blah. But because that's my reading, it's what I learned to read on. I learned to love literature through the classics. my reading is really unbalanced. I have read many, many more white middle-class men than most people, because apart from Edith Wharton and the Brontes and a couple of others, everyone I read was a white middle class, you know, a few others I can think of, but not many before I started choosing. And I still think there is a bias, if not in publishing, and probably in publishing, but definitely in our minds, about who are the great writers, what are the great works of art, what do they look like, what does an author look like, how does an author behave, what background does an author come from, what name might they be called, what might they write. And all, if you interrogate somebody just from the street, maybe a non-writer or a non-reader, and say, what does a writer look like? So it'd be very unusual for them to say Toni Morrison or James Baldwin. They're probably going to say Dickens, Trollope. That has set the tone for the canon. It set the tone for the literary houses. It set the tone for the prizes, I think, for a long time. I think we've got a long way to go before we can banish that. I think it starts in school. It starts on the TV with what gets made into a film. And I think once we stop feeding that diet of the classics to children of 4 and 5 and 11 and 12 and, you know, onwards into exam territory, then I think we will give people a lot more freedom to say what a good book is, and say what a classic is, and say that's an author. I mean, I know my daughter, she's 25 now. When she was at school, she was doing Of Mice and Men. And my niece, who's 7 or 8, is doing Of Mice and Men. There are other books, even by John Steinbeck. Do you know what I mean? But they sort of grab onto a book, and then it's done for 15 years or for 20 years. Yeah. And I just think they could be a bit more expansive and brave at school, and give the teachers some bloody, you know, discretion, for God's sake.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, when I first moved over here, because of course America doesn't have a core curriculum the way that there is one here, and so I grew up in an educational system where you went, when you went to university to study literature, as I did, everybody came from a hugely diverse reading list that had happened in their different schools, and I could not wrap my head around when I started teaching her that the students only knew Of Mice and Men and Gatsby. Those were the 2 books they knew, and I was like, no, none of you have read any other books.
Totally.
It
it's so narrow then, what you think of as a good book, and you think of as what the ingredients of literature are. I can remember there's a book by somebody, it's called Holes, and I think the name is Zaka somebody. Anyway, I read it. I didn't know it was a children's book. And I was like, this is the book for school, you know, and I know some schools do it. But so many just go for the same old. And it's such a shame that other books aren't studied.
Yeah, it is. Obviously, we could keep talking about this all night. We clearly have a lot of ideas in common here, but I want to bring Karina back in and give the audience a chance for some questions. And while she turns on her camera and mic, I will throw a question right back to you, Kit, because there is an audience member who has challenged, I think quite fairly, your position that 50 Shades of Grey doesn't count. And the question is, why doesn't 50 Shades count? This is implying there's something inherent in writing that is deemed acceptable. And so how can we make that distinction?
It's great, because we had a long discussion about it in our group, and we were saying, if popularity matters, why not? You know, let's just go for popularity. And the reason we decided not to include it is not because of the content, but because of the quality of the writing. It wasn't well written. I personally haven't read it, but a number of people had read it, and it's just not, the craft of writing is not there. That's not to do with the content at all. And the content is valid. I mean, Jilly Cooper's on there, you know, so if you're going to talk about sort of, you know, sexy books, Jilly Cooper, who was writing about frolicking in, I don't know, I think it was Riders is on there, which is something to do with, you know, obviously horse riding and sex. And it made, we had a conversation how when certain of us were teenagers, that was where you got your sex education. That's where you felt safe to talk about sex, and you could, get your naughty book, and it would change your life as a young woman. And there's nothing wrong with the content of 50 Shades of Grey, but it isn't well executed. Had it been exactly the same book with some beautiful writing or some clever writing, then I think it would have made the grade.
Yeah. Karina, I've got a question for you on about the, so the question is, I was interested in the typography elements of the design, but also in the Bridget Jones cover. And the question was wondering if an announcement that there's an introduction automatically bumps a novel up the literary scale in readers' perception, which I think is a really interesting question. Does having an introduction make it seem more literary?
I think there's really something in that question, and I would love to draw up an experiment in which you can actually test that, because on an anecdotal level, I would say yes. When you need an introduction, this is something special. And of course, this novel is something special because it's at the start of a whole new genre of chick lit novels. So I think you can see that this is kind of confirming the status of the book. But I'm very curious to see if indeed the rating would change.
Yeah, well, maybe that can be your next
first.
experiment. Yeah, exactly. I agree. It's a really, really interesting question. Kit, there's a question for you about whether you are imagining your audience while you write, while you're leaving the title and the cover to the publisher, but are you thinking about your audience? Or are you just, really trying to just write the thing that you want to write?
I'm trying to write the best book I can. So I don't want to, I wouldn't say I ignore the audience, but I don't write for them. I write I suppose I write for them in as much as I don't want anyone to turn around and say that was really badly written. So I would never write the content for the audience, but I would write to a standard that I would hope the audience could appreciate. I mean, I'm very pleased with myself if I write a nice sentence and I'm thinking someone will read that and they'll get that. And so in that way, I read with respect, I think, is respect for the audience as intelligent readers, but not content-wise. I'm not thinking, oh, they'll like it if he dies now. I wouldn't have that sort of thought process.
There are a couple of questions circling back around to the question I opened with, which was about the ways in which this discussion kind of assumes that we all know what literary means and what it means for a book to be more literary or less literary. And also to your point, Kit, about the quality of the writing in a book like 50 Shades versus in other books. And this is something that those of us who teach fiction, but also I've judged literary fiction. And so it's something, I've judged the Booker Prize and other prizes and been asked exactly that, how do you actually define this? But so the question is to both of you, do you have a working definition? And for the audience who are trying to grapple with what it is that we mean by the shorthand, what is it for each of you that makes something literary or not literary?
For me, and I've never been asked for a definition before, but I would say, does it tell me something new about life? Does it tell me something interesting about life? Has it changed my mind? Has it challenged me? Has it moved me about the big questions? So not the small questions like who did it, but the big questions, is that what life's for? Is that what it's like to love another woman? That's the sort of thing, it's moved me about the big questions in life. That's not to say I love crime thrillers, and who killed someone is actually really interesting, it's entertainment. But whether or not that's literary fiction, I would probably say not. Most often it's not.
Karina, do you have a working definition of literary in your experiment?
No, I very deliberately do not share any thoughts about what I think is literary, not to influence the people who are taking our survey, because what we want to find out is what any reader anywhere thinks may be literary or not. And even if you cannot give a definition to the word, I think you have kind of an idea of what is meant. And that's exactly what we want to find out in our research. So I won't share my ideas.
Fair enough. But then, so there's a question here about the ways that you're using computational linguistic techniques to measure literariness. But then, to what degree does the computational aspect of it just kind of rename in quantitative terms what literariness names in qualitative terms, if you see what I mean? I mean, what is it that we're actually measuring if we haven't defined literariness?
What we try to do in the project is compare the opinions of the readers with the language of the texts. And we only measure the easy things. So sentence length, vocabulary. And for the rest, we will have to do a lot of evaluating, well, what may be playing a role, what may not be playing a role. We don't know yet. We're going to find out, I hope.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. I will look forward to seeing how that interacts. Kit, there's a question for you for your working practices, which is about how closely you work with your editor during your process. And for example, would you agree to major structural changes if your editor said you wanted to draw in the reader more quickly or something like that, or do you try to write it and then present it?
So I write it, and when I send it to my editor and my agent, in my mind, it's perfect and doesn't need a comma changing. And I really mean that. When I send it, it's like, that is perfect. You can just press print. Obviously, that's not what happens, but that's what I have to feel to send it off. No one gets involved in the process. You know, I write the book and then I present the book. And then there's always something to change. You know, at the very least, there'll be copy edits. And major structural work I've never had to do. I've had to add chapters that the editor has missed. I've had to move some later chapters up to the front, but that, you know, hasn't really mattered, or make something an introduction. But no, I really would find it hard to have someone involved. I know there are some writers who will write like 150,000 words and give it to the agent or the editor and say, what's it about? I cannot imagine doing a what's it about. I have to know that really, really well, even before I start to write.
It's so interesting, you know, writers' different processes and the ways that we find our way through these things. I mean, those of us who try to grapple with this stuff on a regular basis, I think, you know, always find it interesting to see how everybody is approaching it differently. There is a question about whether definitions of what is literary are changing over time, and that is both a very long question and a very short question. I'm going to try to squeeze one more in. So if I may, as a literary historian, I'm going to say, yes, definitions of literature are changing over time and literariness are changing over time, but we could do a whole session on evolving meanings of the literary over time and the way that modernism shaped that and the way that our debates now about inclusivity precisely are changing that. But we'll end on a question about kind of where we are now. Which is a question, an audience member, I was going to say listener, an audience member, who has been comfort reading, as we were saying, many of us have been over recent months, but also feels that the pandemic has heightened the need to understand life from different perspectives, and is wondering if we have any tips about how to reconcile those two maybe slightly diverging impulses. Any thoughts?
See, I'll go. I think, yes, I think lockdown, and not just lockdown, but the madness of the world at the moment, and the fact that we are so fractured and separate, and we've all become very tribal, I think, all of us. And I think it's so important for us to read about other lives, and yet we want to comfort read. So it's a difficult thing to manage. I think perhaps reading a book that we know is going to bring us comfort. I read Mick Herron's new novel, Improved, the other day, and I just knew I was going to love it. Not challenging, you know, challenging in exactly the right way. and I will read something else that's sent to me that I don't know anything about. I've read the books for the Booker Prize because I had to do a program about it, and some of them were challenged. They're not books that I would have read, and they've definitely told me about different worlds. But for me, very often there's not that much enjoyment sometimes. You know, it's hard work sometimes to read about something else and to read outside of my comfort. And maybe just in this time, we need to be kind to ourselves and just read whatever, you know, do a crossword. You don't have to read at all. You know, just do what gets you through this really difficult time, whatever that is.
Yeah. Karina, do you have anything to add to that?
I totally agree. You could try to listen to a book as a change. But still a comfort read or listening.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although I also think that that circles us back to the point of lists as well, as Kit was saying, and I quite agree with that. That list of books that are great can expose you to books that you might find both comforting and new, and that could surprise you in that way. Like, for example, we were saying about Arnold Bennett, who everybody always thinks is stuffy and is a hoot. Yes. So is a good. I find him a very comforting read, but he doesn't always look like a comforting read, to the point about covers. His covers don't always suggest this is going to be a fun, light comfort read, but it actually is. So and that of course is the great joy of reading for those of us who love reading, is that there is literally a universe of books that await us. And clearly we could continue to talk about that universe of books all night. But we are going to have to stop our event now. Before I finish, obviously first I'd like to thank Kit and Karina for this conversation, and Karina in particular for your quiz, which, as we say, got us all thinking in different ways. I'd just like to remind everyone that the Being Human Festival runs until the 22nd of November, and some events still have spaces which you can book on our website, and most of which you can attend from the comfort of your own home, speaking of lockdown and pandemic. But one of the great things about the Being Human Festival is that although you can participate at home, it is taking place all over the country. So again, maybe a little bit like that example of something that is both close at home and yet also far afield. You can encounter new worlds, which of course is our theme for this year's festival. Just a reminder that that evaluation is in your chat box. It will also be emailed to you afterwards. And again, we'd be incredibly grateful if you could fill it out for us. If you'd like to support the festival by making a donation, you can go to our webpage and there's a support us link. And of course, we'd be grateful for any support that you can offer. And then just a note that our final event in this Being Human in Conversation series will be this Wednesday at 6 p.m. with Professor Barry Smith, our colleague at the School of Advanced Study, chairing, and he will be presenting an event with Chris Kelly from Absent, which is a charity for people with smell loss, and Dr. Anne-Sophie Barich, author of the much acclaimed book Smellosophy. And they will be discussing the impact of COVID on our sense of smell. And there will be some experiments for you to try out at home with items from your kitchen cupboard. So we hope very much that you'll join us for that event. But for now, tonight, we need to say good night. And please, again, it's so weird not to be able to see everybody and to invite people to applaud virtually, but I will ask everyone please to join me in a virtual round of applause for Kit and Karina. Thank you both very much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.